everybody. Hope you're doing well. 2020 is almost over, so just a few more weeks now. Let's hope we can make it through. Thankfully, the end of this year of years is the Christmas season, and so I wanted to share with you today a few Christmas recipes or something you can do for your socially distanced Christmas feast this year. And today I wanted to focus on the traditional cuisine of Austria. For those of you who watched my video last time, I did Hungary. This time we're doing Austria, right next door. And I'm going to be making three different dishes today. We're going to start by showing you how to make a Schweinsbraten. Schweinsbraten means essentially pork roast. Then I'm going to show you how to make what are called Serviettenknoedel, which means napkin dumpling. And finally, I'll show you how to make a Krautsalat, which means cabbage salad. So these three dishes would traditionally be paired together and would be very common not only in Austria, but also in the neighboring German region of Bavaria and in Bohemia, the Czech Republic. So let's get started. The first thing I'm going to show you is how to prepare a traditional Austrian, German, Czech style pork roast. Okay, so one of the greatest things about a Schweinsbraten is that it takes very, very few ingredients and it's very, very easy to make. So my ingredients here, I have a 3-pound pork roast. I'm using pork butt. You can also use pork shoulder. Your goal is to get some sort of meat that has quite a bit of fattiness. And you also kind of want something that maybe has a little bit of this fat or skin on top, which will allow you to do a kind of special method that allows you to get it a little bit crispy on the top. So this is a good cut to use for that. In addition to your pork roast meat, all you need is salt, freshly ground black pepper, caraway seeds, 1 onion. I'm using a white onion. You could use a white or yellow onion. And some garlic cloves. You're not going to use this many garlic cloves. I just have some pre-peeled garlic to use. And that's it, plus a little bit of water. Those are all the ingredients that you need. It's very easy. Like a lot of Central European recipes, it's not the difficulty of the cooking that might put you off, but it's the time. This is going to take 2 hours. But the good news is, while you're letting your pork roast, you can make the other 2 dishes at the same time and utilize your time that way. So let's get started. All right, as I said, very easy to do. I've set my oven for 350 degrees. I have my 3-pound pork roast in a baking dish here. And all I'm going to do to prepare this, I washed it off with some cold water and dried it off with some paper towels before I put it in the dish, just to kind of get some of those impurities out. And basically all I'm going to do is I'm going to take a sharp knife, and if you have some sort of layer of fat or skin at the top, you're going to want to make a few little cross cuts here. Just kind of cut through that into the skin. Just a little hash pattern. Hopefully, if this works out the way I want it to, at the end you're going to have a nice little crispy crust of skin there, but we'll see. Okay, that's basically it. Next, very easy, you are going to cover with some nice sea salt. Nice fresh pepper, and some caraway seeds. Caraway is really the thing that gives this the traditional flavor. I had said in the last video that I'm not a big fan of caraway seeds, but to be honest, for this recipe, they're essential, and I do kind of like them in this context. So flip it over with the side that you've cut on the bottom. salt, pepper, caraway seeds. Next, you are going to take an onion. You're just going to peel it. Quarter it. Does not have to be pretty. You are only using this onion to help flavor the roast. And you're going to just kind of break it up with your hands here and put some of the pieces of the onion kind of at various points here around the roast. I didn't need the whole thing. That's okay. So I used about 3/4 of the onion there. Next, you're going to do the same thing with some garlic cloves. I had some pre-peeled garlic, but you can just peel your own garlic or whatever. Put those in. Around. We'll give it some nice flavor. Final step. You're going to need some water. Just enough water to kind of come around a little bit. Because you are roasting this for 2 hours, you need to have some moisture. Now, once it's roasting in the pan for a while, you might want to periodically open up the oven and take a little bit of this water and dump it over, or maybe even take some fresh water and dump it over. You just don't want the roast to dry out. So folks, that's basically it. You have your pork roast in the pan, you have your seasoning on it, you have your onions, you have your garlic. I'm going to put this in an oven at 350 degrees. I'm going to do 90 minutes on this side right here. 90 minutes. Maybe once or twice during that 90 minutes, I'll check on it. I'll make sure there's enough moisture. Then after 90 minutes, you are going to take it out. You're going to flip it over, and you're going to cook it for another 30 minutes with the side that you cut up. And that's it. I'm going to pop this in the oven, and I will see you once I start making the next dish. Okay, so our pork roast has been in the oven for about half an hour so far. I checked on it. I poured a little extra water on it just to make sure that it stays nice and moist. Next step is to make our so-called napkin dumplings, Serviettenknoedel. This is kind of a typical bread dumpling, but it's done in a special way, which I'll show you, which is where you're going to put it inside a cloth napkin. The food ingredients that you need for this are as follows. I have a pound here of unseasoned stuffing bread. So just like basically dried out bread. You can make this yourself. You can take some stale bread, you can put it in the oven. I just bought this as is. You know, it's around Thanksgiving time, so this is readily available. So a pound of stuffing bread. I have 2 cups of warm milk right here. I have 3 eggs. I have 2 tablespoons of flour, just regular all-purpose flour. I have about a teaspoon and a half of salt. And I have 1 bunch of Italian parsley or flat leaf parsley. Okay, don't get curly parsley. So these are the things that we're going to use to make the bread dumpling, the napkin dumpling. Let's get started. First step here is we are going to take some warm milk and we are going to pour it over the bread mixture here. Every time I've tried to make these, I think I've always thought, oh, that's too dry, and I've upped the milk amount, and half the times my dumplings have fallen apart. So we're not going to make that same mistake. I'm only putting exactly the amount of milk in the recipe. So 2 cups of milk into this pound of dumpling mix. We're going to let that sit for a little bit. While we're letting that sit, We are going to mix in 3 eggs. Just break them in a little bowl. And give them a little stir there. We're going to dump that over our mixture here. We're going to add in our salt. And the last step is we are going to hack up some of this parsley. So just take a bunch here, cut off the stems. I'm just going to give that a fine chop. As I've said before, my cutting skills are not the best. I am not a professional chef. I am just a man who likes to eat good food. Alright, so we have our parsley bunch hacked up there. Make sure that you don't have anything that's too big. And now, the fun part. We are going to mix this by hand. Just get in there, doesn't matter if a couple of the little guys fall out, that's not a problem. Make sure you get all of the milk and the egg mixture in there. All right, our dough is done, and we are going to let that sit for 1 hour before we form it into a loaf, mix in some flour, and boil it in a napkin in some boiling water. And I will see you later. Talk a little bit about Christmas in Austria and Germany and that sort of area. Christmas traditionally in that part of the world is very important. Many of our Christmas traditions come from Austria and southern Germany and Bohemia and that general region. The song Silent Night, for example, is originally an Austrian carol. And many of those sort of Germanic traditions, like the Christmas tree, are things that are very important to Americans as well. Traditionally, in Austria and southern Germany, the most important event or day is actually Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve is when the families would come together for a big meal. After the meal, they generally go and open presents in something that's called a Bescherung, which is a very sort of special event. And it's actually at that time when people traditionally decorate their Christmas trees. Now, nowadays, people probably do it a little earlier, We like Americans like to have ours up not long after Thanksgiving, but in historic times, that's when people would actually decorate the tree, would be on Christmas Eve, open their presents, and then go to church, usually like a midnight mass type situation. Now, despite that, this pork roast recipe would probably not be a meal that you would have on Christmas Eve. The reason being, in historic times, and to some extent today, Christmas Eve was considered a fasting day. Kind of like some people fast on Fridays during Lent. Christmas Eve was also part of a Advent fast, which lasted from the period before Christmas up until Christmas Eve. And so that was the last fasting day. And so a traditional meal on Christmas Eve would be something like a carp, okay, a fish. They would do some sort of fish because it was not permitted to eat meat on Christmas Eve. Now, traditions have changed, and typically people are doing more roasts, like something like this, or a goose, or a turkey even are typical. Another thing that I know is common is people like to do sort of communal type eating. There's something called raclette, where you take pieces of this special cheese and melt it over ingredients, or they might do like a fondue, or like a meat fondue, where you take pieces of meat and put it in boiling water, something sort of a communal style eating. However, on Christmas Day, something like this would be very common. And in fact, roasts, and in this region especially a pork roast, would be very typical for not only Christmas Day, but also many other types of holidays. Why a roast? It's big, it feeds a lot of people, it's not really that difficult to prepare, and of course, like everything else that you want to cook, it's delicious. So this would not necessarily be a Christmas Eve meal, this would be more of a Christmas Day meal or in the Christmas time. One other reason for the pork roast as a specific recipe that would be used at this time is this was around the time of year that people would slaughter their pig. So in traditional farming societies, people would usually wait till the winter months to slaughter the pig because of the cold weather, and it was easier to process the meat at that time, and so you might have a nice pork roast ready in your farm family after the pig slaughter, and that's something that you could do with that meat. So that's kind of why I chose Schweinsbraten as a representative Austrian, German, Bohemian Christmas meal. And we have about 25 minutes left on the roast. We're letting our dumpling bread set, and I will see you in a short amount of time to show you the next step. Okay, so this is the roast after an hour and a half. You can see it's cooking very nicely. The top, little bit on the dry side. I poured some water over it, but that's okay because now we are going to flip it. Let's see if I can do this without putting a hot roast on my poor film crew here. All right. So we have it flipped over there. It looks like we have plenty of liquid in there, and we are going to put it back into the oven for at least 30 minutes. As I was thinking about it, this is a slightly bigger roast than the recipe called for. I might end up leaving it in there a little bit longer than 2 hours. We'll see. But at least we're going to put it in there for 30 more minutes. And we are going to get going on the rest. Okay, the moment of truth. Our dumpling dough has been sitting for 1 hour. Fingers crossed, or as they do in Austria and Germany, thumbs pressed to make sure that everything worked out okay. So we are now adding the last ingredient, which is 2 tablespoons of flour. And kneading that in, just to make sure that everything is going to hold together. I have attempted these before with limited success, So I'm hoping that this works this time. As I think I mentioned before, the problem was I think that I was probably freaking out at how wet, or excuse me, how dry the dough was, and then putting in overcompensating with the milk or with the egg or something like that. This time I have not done that. You have a nice firm dough. So hopefully that will be okay. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to make sure that I have wet fingers. And let's see how this goes. I have my pot of boiling salt water going here. And I have some cloth napkins. That's why these are called napkin dumplings, Serviettenknoedel. So when you make a standard dumpling, you would usually just form it into a ball and put it directly into the boiling water. This gives you a little bit more of a little bit more control over what you're doing. So we just form it in like this into our damp napkin. Make sure you're using a cloth napkin. I think that goes without saying, but you know, I don't want to be accused for when you put in a paper napkin and be like, why doesn't this work? All right, so you form it into a loaf like that. You roll it, tie it off like that, and then you can get some twine and just kind of make sure it's around there nice and tight. You don't want any of the mix to come out. Tie it there. There. Just kidding. Part of the fun of live cooking. All right, I'm pretty happy with that. That looks nice and tight. That looks ready to go. I am going to continue with this dough. I'm going to make another one of these. I'm going to put it into the boiling water for about 35 to 40 minutes. And God willing, it will come out as a loaf. I'll see you on the next step. Okay, if you're still with me, we have our roast in. I decided to let it go for another 20 minutes or so because it's a bigger roast. We have our napkin dumplings in, and now it's time to make the final thing, which is called Krautsalat. Krautsalat basically just means cabbage salad. And this is a variation that you can kind of play with. If you were to have this dish in Bohemia, for example, they would almost certainly use sauerkraut. And so feel free to sub in sauerkraut for this point. Sauerkraut's easier to make, whatever. But I personally like it with Krautsalat, which has some similarities to sauerkraut, but instead of being sort of fermented cabbage, we're using fresh cabbage. So the ingredients for this are very simple. You're going to use a head of cabbage, pretty big one. You're going to use half a cup of vegetable oil, half a cup of white wine vinegar. This is white wine vinegar. You can use just regular white vinegar, but I think this has a more subtle taste that works better for this, since you know, it's kind of a prominent feature in this dish. For spices, seasonings, you are going to have 2 teaspoons of sugar, 2 teaspoons of caraway. I actually doubled the sugar amount because I want mine a little bit sweeter, but that's okay. And then 2 tablespoons of salt. And finally, because it wouldn't be a recipe from Central Europe without a little bit of bacon, I have some hickory smoked bacon here that I'm going to dice up, and that's going to round off the cabbage salad. So next I will show you how to do this. All right, in the interest of time, I've done a few of these steps beforehand. So what I've done so far is I've added the sugar, the salt, the caraway, the oil, and the vinegar into a little saucepan and brought that to a boil. I just turned the heat off just now. I've chopped up the bacon. We're going to be using that later. And I've already done the majority of the work on the cabbage. I just saved a little bit so I can show you the process here. So you are just going to hack this up. It really depends on how fine you want it. You could use like a mandolin or some other kind of slicer if you want sort of like more of a coleslaw consistency. I'm just doing kind of a rough chop here. So I've taken my cabbage, I've washed it, I've quartered it, and then I'm just sort of like cutting it into rough sort of strips here like this. As I see how big this cabbage is, I don't think I'm going to use the whole thing. I think I'm just going to use about 2/3, 3/4 of it. All right. Again, you could make this finer. You could make this more of like a coleslaw consistency, but I think that's perfectly fine. The rest of this cabbage we can just use to make something else, maybe like a beef stew or something. Now I am going to pour my hot dressing mixture onto it. I'm going to mix that up. And I'm going to let that sit for about 20 minutes to a half an hour while my roast finishes. We're almost at the end. The last step is going to be to cook some of this bacon and mix the kraut in with it. And at that point, we should be pretty much done. Fingers crossed, thumbs pressed. I'll see you towards the end. Okay, moment of truth number one. Let's see what this Schweinsbraten looks like. Looking pretty good. You can see that you got a little bit of crispiness here on the crust. If you really want it crispy, you can put it under the broiler for a little bit. I'm okay with the way it is right there. But as I said, I told you at the beginning to put it in for 2 hours. This was a little bit bigger roast, so I ended up putting it in for 2.5 hours. But this looks pretty much perfect when it comes to a doneness level. So step one successful. And now let's move on to step two. Moment of truth number two, the napkin dumpling reveal. I've taken them out of the boiling water. They're in there for about 40 minutes. I've cut the string. I'm actually pretty nervous about this. I should open this up and it should be a nice loaf as opposed to all falling apart. It's a loaf! We did it! We made a bread dumpling. Okay. Perfect. Yeah, that's exactly what you want. That's exactly the texture that you want. It's firm. It's not falling apart. It's still moist. It hasn't dried out yet. So that's perfect. All right, I'm going to let this dumpling, remember I made two. So this is just the first one. But I'm going to let this dumpling cool off. I'm going to let the roast rest a little bit. We have about 5 minutes left on the cabbage salad before the very last step. So we're nearing the end, folks. Hope you've borne with me so far. Okay, in the interest of time, I went ahead and browned the hickory smoked bacon. You don't want it to be too crunchy, just kind of somewhat crunchy, a little bit still fatty. And so you've released all that nice bacon fat into there. I'm going to turn my heat down, and the cabbage salad, which has been marinating for about half an hour, I'm going to introduce that into there. And on a fairly low heat, I'm going to just stir it in there with all that nice bacon grease. The cabbage has already been soaking in oil and vinegar and seasoning, and it's already started to wilt, but by putting it in the bacon grease like this and cooking it on a low heat, you're going to let it wilt a little bit more. You're not looking for cooked cabbage. You still want it to have a little bit of crunch there, but also be pliable. You know, the reason that you do combinations like this, you know, you have the rich pork, you have the bread sort of gives you some filling, you know, it's sort of like a filler. And then you have something like a sauerkraut or a Krautsalat, which helps to cut through some of the fattiness of the meat and helps to kind of give you that acidic counterpoint. So that's the reason why in Central European cooking, a lot of times you have something sour paired with a meat, and then also some sort of like a bread or a potato to help fill the meal out. All right, we're going to let this cook down for about 6-7 more minutes, and then I will be ready to show you the final product. We've come to the end. Take a look. Here is your Schweinsbraten, Serviettenknoedel, Krautsalat, and you can serve this with whatever you want. I like to serve it with beer or wine. Let's have a taste here. For the star of the show, the pork roast, nice and tender. Very good. Very juicy. The seasoning is just perfect. Even though there's not a whole variety of seasoning, that caraway really works well with the pork. You have that nice, slightly crusty upper part. The meat is very tender. You have these nice fatty parts. So, step one, so far so good. Try the bread dumpling. I covered this with some of the juice, some of the drippings from the pan. This hopefully, well, it's not falling apart, so that's good. Gotta make sure it's not too dry. Also good. You're looking for a texture that's still kind of spongy, that's cooked all the way through, and that hasn't started to get kind of crusty in the middle. So that worked out well. We're going for the trifecta. Three out of three. The Krautsalat could have cooked maybe a little bit longer. It's a little bit on the crunchier side, but that's okay. I think it pairs well with others very much. And then finally, after all the efforts, Prost. All right, well, I think it was a success. I hope that some of you will give it a try. Thank you very much for watching. I have been informed by my producer that there may be a super special dessert episode coming right up after this. We're not sure. If not, then I hope you enjoyed what I did, but you might get a little something extra. I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season. Thank you to the library for making this all happen. And I wish you frohe Weihnachten and guten Rutsch im neues Jahr. I'm sure I screwed the grammar up and I will be castigated online, but that's how it goes. Frohe Weihnachten, everybody. Merry Christmas. Have a good one. Bye.